The better students do.
That's still true. Pay attention.
Yeah. Well, so when I have people visit campus, they're always like, "Well, how many students are in each class?" I said, "If you're in the front row, 10. If you're in the back row, 300. It's your choice." All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Since the bus seems to have arrived. So, as Dennis led us last week, we're hitting the question, should Christians fight cultural and political wars? And last week, Dennis did a great job leading us through the question of should we fight the culture war. Today, we are going to not answer the question, should Christian fight the political war, but we're going to discuss it. Okay, so I don't want to lead you astray and say we're going to solve a problem that we don't have, yet. But we would like to discuss it. And so don't look for a final answer, look for the start of a conversation. And I would like to point out that Christ is Lord over all in all of this. Amen. And so, there we go. All right, so this is our outline briefly today. I want to give us a little bit of sense of context, and so I'm going to spend the first 10 minutes kind of thinking through, like Dennis did, a couple hundred years of history. Why are we at where we are? What is unique about our context in America? We'll discuss why do we have to discuss politics and religion? And then a lot of our time will be spent doing discussion. And then I would like us to anchor ourselves in what does the Bible say about these things? And then wrap it up with some kind of a conclusion. So let me start off by asking two very simple questions. What's freedom? What's liberty? No, I'll take an answer. Synonymous, right?
Can we use our phone to look it up?
No, either one. I don't care which one you define, but I want to know what it means.
You mean to the Christian?
I was purposely vague on that point. You can tell me what it means to the Christian, or you can tell me what it means in our culture. I'll take either one.
Well, freedom for the Christian is the freedom to live the life that God intended for us. It's made possible for us through Christ's death and especially through His resurrection. And it allows us to live the way we were intended because we were created by Him.
Great. What then does freedom in our culture get represented as? Just for juxtaposition.
Do anything you want.
It's whatever I want to do. So this is one of the first things that we have to talk about when we look at America and how it's founded, because the words liberty and freedom and happiness show up a lot in the founding documents. And it's worth pointing out that there's a history behind those words and that the meaning of those words have shifted. So we're going to go back to Dennis's age of mobilization, where he talked about this guy named Martin Luther who screwed everything up. Right? So before Martin Luther, if I had a question about how I should worship, who did I ask? The priest. And ultimately that authority went up to the Pope. So after Martin Luther, you end up with various countries setting up their own churches. And in 1534, Henry VIII, really nice guy, decided that he was going to declare himself the head of the church. So now this creates an interesting problem. If I want to ask, how do I worship? I don't go to someone who's religious, who is the head of the church. I go to someone who's the head of the state. And the Bible's pretty clear about the differences between head of the religious aspect, say, in Israel versus the head of the state in Israel. The king and the priest were always very separate. So this created a lot of problems, which the Puritans ran into. Yes?
Wasn't the monarch in England also the head of the church?
He declared himself the head of the church in England. Before that, it was Catholic.
Okay.
Right? And so when it was Catholic, the Pope was always the ultimate head of the church. Henry VIII created the Anglican Church and declared himself to be the head of it, which meant that you had a secular individual telling people how they should or should not worship.
That was because he needed to get rid of water.
Well, yes, he had political reasons for doing it. Paul?
Also, under Christendom, you had this idea that the king was also under God, like
Yeah.
David and the high priest.
Yes, yes.
Some
So you do have this,
under God.
you at least have this idea that the king should be ultimately accountable to God. But one of the big factors for the Puritans is that they did not like the idea that the king was telling them how they should worship. And perhaps the best quote I could find on this is from a gentleman who wrote a book called The First Thanksgiving. And he phrases it this way, and Dave eloquently said it before, which is the Pilgrims thought liberty and freedom, as they thought of liberty as the freedom to do what's right, not to decide what's right. In their view, the persecution they had experienced in England was not wrong because it violated their natural right to worship according to the dictates of conscience. It was wrong because it impeded their divine obligation to worship God according to the dictates of Scripture. So the first point that I want to make is that when we are talking as Christians about freedom, freedom is something that allows us to fulfill obligation, which is very different than the individualism that we have in our culture. And that's a good thing to kind of start us talking about, because that also means that if we have a country that has freedom without obligation, we now have a country that has freedom but without any moral anchor, and so there's dangers there. All right, so then this raises the question, should the church address politics? Whew, let me give you two quotes. This one is from a book called What If Jesus Had Never Been Born? And James Kennedy writes, "The road to American freedom was paved in large part by the pulpits of New England. Sermons from the colonial era helped shape the American understanding that resistance to tyranny is obedience to God." And in today's context, this idea of resistance to tyranny sounds kind of weird, but in that context, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about the government telling them how they should worship when their conscience and what they feel is what they know is the obligation of Scripture is saying otherwise. And so tyranny comes in and says you can't worship in a certain way. The most modern version that we have of this was during COVID when the government in many states said you can't worship in person. This would fit under their definition of tyranny. And then in 1773, this is just an example of the time. The top one's a modern quote. The bottom one says, this was a sermon given by the Reverend Charles Turner in Massachusetts, not to necessarily to the congregation, but specifically before the governor of the state of Massachusetts. And he says, "Scriptures cannot rightly be expounded without explaining them in a manner that is friendly to the cause of freedom." So the point that I'm making here with these slides, the first slide says that freedom for the Christian is different than other freedoms. The second point is that early on in America, the idea that the church would speak into politics was present because the church felt that this idea of freedom was quintessential to what the church was. In other words, they're speaking into something that is within the purview of the church, related to the politics. All right, let's hit the next one. Ooh, I'll let this one settle for a little bit. Is America a Christian nation?
Whether it's good or not, the world as a whole views it as it is.
Okay.
Christian is individual.
Okay.
It was founded on a scriptural-based morality.
Yeah, so it was founded on scriptural-based morality. The answer to this question is it depends on what you define as a Christian nation. Does a Christian nation mean that the underpinnings of the form of government rested on basic Christian morals? Or does it mean that Christians use the government to push their morals? Because those are two very different things. So I'm not going to answer that question because we have to define what that means. And I will say if churches get involved in politics more, we should have a very good definition of what that means. One definition of a Christian nation might actually mean a secular nation, where Christians are free to worship. Yes?
What you just said, though, 2 sentences ago, about the separation of church and state, which is incorrectly viewed mostly these days, but about a government pushing a morality.
Right.
Yeah, so technically that's what separation of church and state was about, right?
No. There's a difference between the government saying this is morality versus this is how you can and cannot worship God.
I understood those to be the same, but okay, gotcha.
All right, so let's go with some quotes. David Gibbs writes a book. He's the president of the Christian Law Association. By the way, his book is great. But he says that a biblical understanding of sinfulness of man was the guiding principle behind the U.S. Constitution. So this gets to Dennis's point. James Madison, I'm trying to grab a new quote and an old quote, by the way, says that there is a degree of depravity in mankind. That's an interesting idea. Which requires a degree of circumspection and distrust. On the other hand, there's qualities which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. The Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. One of the interesting parts of America is that it's based upon these core understanding of humans, mankind's sinfulness, and as well as general grace. And so as such, the structures that were formed used a biblical understanding of mankind as kind of their foundational piece. We're okay with that idea? I would flip it a little bit differently when I ask, what's a Christian nation? Does the church need America? No. It's existed throughout centuries. It doesn't need America. But does America need Christianity? It's a very different question. And so I would think about that question in different ways. Okay, so here's what we want to do. We want to talk about politics and religion. Why are we even here? Well, we're here because that picture, I think, was the old picture from 20 years ago, where you had church, you had culture, you had government, and nowadays, culture and government have enlarged, and the church has said, what do we do? And so we find ourselves in a position where now government and culture are speaking into issues that are deeply the domain of the church. Now, we said Christ reigns overall, but we now have kind of forced conflicts where we no longer can say, well, we're going to let politics be politics, because government is speaking into things that the church has very clear rules on what they say. I shouldn't say rules, but very clear scriptural basis for addressing certain issues. Transgenderism, abortion, just to be a few examples. Okay, that was my hopefully brief introduction. That gets us where we're starting. So, let's hit a couple discussion guidelines. They say you're not supposed to talk about politics and religion, right? We talk a lot about religion here, so we're used to that. We know how to handle things. I'm trusting that we can do that. So, my main piece of this guideline is to dig past the superficial. If somebody says something, you go, what? Ask them a question that probes deeper. I often find in these discussions that we have a lot more in common once we dig deep enough, and then it's good to find that common point and then figure out how we got from that common point to different places. That helps us grow. Okay, so I have 5 questions that I'm going to hand out. Dennis, could you help me? And they are quotes, some new, some old. I've purposely left off the person who made the quote. We'll hit that in a minute. But I want you to ponder the following.
So 1 to each.
1 question to each group, and there's 2 sets of questions.
Aha. Okay. So I'm still confused, but that's okay. 1, 2, 3,
Each
4,
group
5.
gets a stack.
Okay, they get the stack.
They get the stack.
Good. We got it.
All right, so the questions are divided in the following way. What is the importance of the statement? Second question, would it matter if the statement was true or not true? Third question, and this is the fun one, do you agree or disagree with the quote? And I want you to find 1 reason you agree with the quote as a group and 1 reason you disagree.
Are those questions on the slips?
Yes, no, the questions aren't in the slips. I'm going to leave these questions up here. And then I'd kind of like to know, do you find this quote comforting or uncomfortable? Are you okay with the question? So you've got a quote from someone. I want you to, as a group, discuss that quote Ask whether or not as a group you think it's true. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? And then we'll come back together. There are 5 quotes, and so we'll have a chance to share out afterwards. Go.
Jeff, what size groups are you Thank you.
said this ahead of time, but the quotes are intended to be a little provocative. So let's hop together. This was quote number 2. I'm going to go 2 then 1 just to see, throw stuff off for our mathematician in the room. So quote number 2, the foundations of our society and our government rest so much on the teachings of the Bible, it would be difficult to support them if the faith in these teachings ceased to be practically universal in this country. Another form of the same statement, without God, there could be no American form of government, nor American way of life. Recognition of the supreme being is the first and the most basic expression of Americanism. Thus, the Founding Fathers saw it. Thus, with God's help, it will continue to be. All right, so number 2.
Did we get the same questions? Because we're number 5.
This is 5.
Oh, that's 5? Oh, good. Number 5. I'm starting way out of order. Great. So we have 2 groups with number 5? All right, so remember, we are, do you agree or disagree? Is it comforting or comforting? And on number 1 or 2, what do you think? Do we have a volunteer?
Well, we basically think these statements are true,
Okay.
but what we think is that we're having this discussion because of the negative implications of both of those statements.
Okay.
We're just disturbed.
In what way? Elaborate on your disturbance.
I just wanted to say, we are so far away from that original good thought and good plan that it's just so disturbing that we're just going down the toilet.
Okay. We'll talk through it.
That's what it is. Oh.
So, anyone want to hazard a guess on what year this quote came from? Or either one. 1900s. All right. So we have Calvin Coolidge, our 30th president, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, our 34th president. So these are mid-1900s, early 1900 statements, which is kind of a fascinating thing.
Wasn't it Eisenhower who also said, though, that, we need to believe in some, being, I don't care what it is, just as long as you believe it?
I don't know that quote, but there's context in all of these. All right, so let's hit the next one. Was there anything else that one of the 5 groups wanted to say on that before I move on? We're okay?
I think that those statements have been true for
A long time.
a long time, and then lately, because the lack of belief in God, that also affects who we elect and what our government is doing. So the crumbling is because of it.
So I would say that this was perceived nationally to be true before, is not perceived to be true now, but whether or not it's true is not dependent on perception. And so that's worth, anyway, we'll leave it. All right, let me make one other comment before I close down and sign this bill. There's a great debate abroad and in the land which finds itself injected into several political races about the extent to which people of faith can seek to do God's will as political actors. I would like to come down on the side of encouraging everyone to act on what they believe is the right thing to do. No? Oh, interesting. All right, elaborate. Which groups? Yeah? Okay, so elaborate.
So I think our conclusion was just that this is already what we actually do.
Yeah.
It's kind of, as Christians, like the freedom to act based on, this is kind of like what our foundation is, but it's also in the context of having created like this moral and like this structure of government that we have today. So like you can't really just do whatever you want or do what you think is right without that structure. And
Okay.
So
doing what you believe to be right needs some moral framework in order to determine what's right. Okay, good. That's a piece of it. What about this group?
We were talking about even just trying to make sense of the quote in the context that you led with or that you included at the beginning.
Yeah,
because the very last sentence, I heard you mention it, Dennis, that has the ring of Judges to it, right? The last sentence of Judges. However, is the quote giver saying that people, in the context of political races and whether or not Christians can seek God's will as politicians or in the politics sphere, I think is the quote person saying that they think that people just need to decide one way or the other? It seemed like almost they're taking a fence-sitting position, or Peter was talking about how they're encouraging any person of faith to participate in politicking.
Yeah, kind of like
I interpreted it that way, but I'm happy to hear all of this.
Yeah, kind of like what Daniel was saying, like everybody, I think what they're saying is, yeah, I'm gonna bring my Christianity into politics because I have to, and pretty much everyone does, because everyone has to, like when you're, if a politician is deciding whether to sign a bill or something, they have to decide whether to sign it, like to sign it or not. They have to have some decision of what's right or wrong in order to make this decision about how to sign this. And I think that every person is coming with some sort of framework. It's just this person, I think, is seeming to say that Christianity is one of the things that they're taking into consideration.
Okay. Other comments? Did this quote make you comfortable or uncomfortable?
I think if we only read that last sentence and devoid of the context of everything else, that's uncomfortable. But the comfortable part would be seeing this idea that we have the opportunity to do God's will.
Yeah, so the second sentence seems to be comforting, the third sentence kind of discomforts that, yeah? Alright, so this was Bill Clinton while he was signing the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. Now, I found the juxtaposition between these two statements, which clearly say the foundation is a moral Christian foundation versus everyone can do what they want, but still, as Christians, you should have the right to bring that into the political sphere. I'd say we're 30 years later, the thing we hear now is we should keep all politics out of religion. So we've gone in a very short amount of time down an interesting trail. Oh. Yes, thank you. Whew. All right, so let's hit the next one. I'm sorry for the groups that got this question. You're going to do the best job you can. I think I've always held the view I would never tell anyone how to vote. But I think given the Democrats' party under increasing commitment to a whole variety of social issues, it becomes harder and harder for me to imagine that I could ever vote Democrat. I'm not sure I would ever say that from the pulpit, but when you're pushing transgenderism, when you're pushing abortion, I think these things, you're really starting to hit things that strike at the heart of what it means to be a human being. Dehumanization. Thoughts? All right, you had 5. Who else had 5? You did as well. Okay.
Start there.
Yeah, right over here. Good, well done, John. He told me he was only going to do 1-word answers, and he already gave him 2.
Yeah, we felt it was an uncomfortable question.
Yeah, it is.
It's a little unsettling to have this before you. Just talked about how, especially lately, just this polarizing feel that's separated families, separated workplace, and now has seeped into the church setting. That just these hot topics, so to speak. Yeah, a little bit on the history, and just one of the things I said is almost like, to define a Christian nation, but when we were first founded, we were really probably considered more of a nation of Christians, which gave the framework of this life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the framework for Christians to grow and thrive. The dichotomy of that is it's flipped morally, that now it's given those freedoms and whatnot for people to live outside of the boundaries that the church once had more of a guide on, that now that those have just become blurred and smeared, and we're facing this snowball of...
You mean humans were given kind of free will and they did what they wanted with it and ate from the tree of the knowledge of way. All right. All right, other thoughts on this one? It did. All right, quick thumbs up, thumbs down. How many of you are kind of uncomfortable? Oh, you had another comment. Good.
Just the fear of the Democrat. Democratic Party from this statement, it was hard for me to hear too.
Yeah.
Because the man of God who is seeing the power of God, but not necessarily enough to preach just from the word. And that's the standpoint of the Christian congregation is.
Yeah.
It feels like a lot of fear in that party. Fear that.
So one piece of this that's worth pointing out is that this was not a sermon given, but this was at the Magnify Conference this year, spoken by Carl Truman. And it struck me, I was like, wow, that's quite a statement. Now, you can go back and watch the whole thing and listen to the context with which he makes that statement. But to me, the reason I wanted to bring this statement forward was because he made a very strong political statement, but then he linked it to the heart of Christianity, which means what does it mean to be a human being? And is the platform of this party aligned with what Christians view, or is it not? And we could do the same thing with either party.
Right.
But I wanted to just hit this because this is the type of statement that makes us really uncomfortable, but it is the type of statement that I do think we as Christians should be able to wrestle with and converse around. All right, I'm going to leave that one there. Easier one. It's high time we broke with our theologically based restraint towards states' actions, which after all is only fear. Speak for those who cannot speak. Who in the church today realizes that this is the very least that the Bible requires of us? Abe, your group. And since I pointed to you, you can assign who to speak.
Yeah, what do you think?
Mr. Wyman, no.
Well, I think it took us a while to maybe interpret what this quote was talking about. But
Yeah. No context.
if you focus on the speak for those who cannot speak, we felt very strongly that there is a biblical mandate for doing this. And I also think that there are times in which, I'll just speak for myself, but I personally can justify restraint through some quasi-biblical argument.
Yeah.
If I hear about injustice or persecution, it's easy for me to think, oh well, if they hadn't been doing this thing, then these bad things wouldn't have happened to them, right? Or we have laws for reasons, or I need to obey the government, it's what Romans says, so I'm just going to keep quiet on this. But I think that the convicting part is that maybe that really is only fear. And if you think about the kinds of people that Jesus loved and spent time with, and think about the people that I love and spend time with, I'm not sure they're really the same types of people. And so I would give this a +1 in theory, but it does trouble my own convictions a little bit.
Was there another group that had this question? Yeah.
We did, but we didn't get a chance to discuss it.
Okay. Any guesses? What era or what time? Is this a modern day quote, an ancient quote?
States is action. Like collective action.
What does it say? I don't really look at it.
Yeah, so the speaker is saying that we are silent in the face of things that the government is doing, and we shouldn't be. We should be speaking God's truth into how the government is doing certain things. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be civil war, that could be immigration, that could be abortion, I mean, you could...
Yeah, it could be all sorts of different times. Isn't it great to have it without context? This particular one is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Time to take out the leader, that's right. So I like this quote because it can be applicable at so many times, you have to ask yourself, is it applicable at this time? Right? And Christians, I think, will fall in different camps on that piece. All right, last one. We have no government armed with the power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion, avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry. Would break the strongest chords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. I love that metaphor. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Which group? Yes?
We had to define a lot of terms there.
Okay.
Parse what that all means. But essentially, sort of how we tried to summarize it is that everyone has
right? So that seems to sort of indicate that. And that there are things that the government is capable to do and not do, right? So it
Right.
sort of draws that line. And then it delineates what we can trust the government to do, or what the government, what the government might expect of us, or our expectations of the government. As far as we were sort of at a mix of our comfortableness with it, right? Like there's some senses in which it's maybe speaks some truth that sort of is comforting, but maybe it's not I don't know, like personally, even the idea that, human passion and morality, like that might be true, but it doesn't make it comfortable necessarily. So it's comfortable truth, but an uncomfortable truth that it's expressing.
Yeah. It's an interesting statement when we ask what it means to be a Christian nation, right? Because this implies that our Constitution cannot take a nation of non-Christians and apply morality. It has to be a nation of Christians that's governing. And so, it's kind of a very uncomfortable thing. Abe?
Is that what he's saying? He says the Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people, which seems quite different from Christian people.
Go on.
Maybe I don't want to give away who it was that said this, but maybe at that time, this person didn't have that distinction in their mind.
He didn't have that distinction.
And we discussed that too. We kind of said, it's one thing if it's sort of Christian, but that doesn't necessarily mean it works in our world today, or that it
Right. And I think Abe's point is that you have other moral frameworks,
Right.
right? But there must be a moral framework. Yeah. Religious.
Our discussion walked off from that too. First of all, we agree there's a lot of need for definition in some of these terms.
Yes.
But we also talked about, okay, what moral framework and what religious people are we talking about? Because we're at a point in our society today where everybody's writing their own morality and their own what's right and wrong. And if it's right for me and it's not for you, then that's okay. We've got our own. But each one of us still has a limit. And we talked to some degree about, okay, if some people today have decided that stealing is okay for me, when the shoe's on the other foot and somebody breaks into their house, it's probably not okay anymore. And we've seen this in some of our cities and stuff that have gone through the defund police and things like that. But as soon as something goes haywire with one of those leaders that is approved of that, who do they want to call? They want to call the police. So there's a discrepancy there, and we also talked about that idea of where do you draw that line? Because if somebody's decided that stealing is okay, then the next person is going to decide that murder is okay.
So this is the piece where it says, human passions unbridled by morality and religion. There must be, at least according to this speaker, some bridlement. And yes, this was John Adams. Abe, did you get that one? Madison? You got it? Okay. And again, this goes back to our idea that when the framers built the Constitution, this is how they're thinking about what they're doing. Yes? We'll make it fast and then I want to move on because I'm running low on time.
And if you understand how immoral and irreligious we all are, it means that no government is
Well,
adequate.
yes and no, right? It does speak to the purpose that we need government, right? We can't have anarchy. We're definitely not Judges era. Okay.
Those four things haven't broken our government yet.
Yeah, we're working on it. Okay. So, but that speaks to the question of is this a true statement or is it not a true statement, right? That's I don't know. It's an interesting question. Let's see. Looking at our time, I'm going to come back to this one in a little bit. Let me hit a couple biblical thoughts, or at least some places to draw our attention. And I'm not going to say that that when I pull up a passage that this is the right interpretation of this passage. I'm open to that discussion. what I want to say is that some of these passages and some of these thoughts can give us a framework to discuss some of these things. So, what do the following people have in common? They're sinners. Good. We could put everyone on the board. Nice job. What was that? They went against the government. Anyone else? Took a stand. Good. What else? Yes, many of them were Jews. All of them. Abraham the first.
Certainly in different ways.
They have different ways of doing things. All of these people served in government roles. And the red ones served in non-religious government roles in foreign nations. And I point this out just to say that we have a long history in the Bible of God putting people into places of government to enact salvation for their people. And I think in some senses there's an idea that maybe Christians shouldn't get involved in government. I think the Bible clearly says, it clearly says that it's a reasonable thing to have Christians in positions of power, being active and being available to God to enact salvation for people. Second thing, Adam and Eve were put in the garden, right? Yes.
Can I
Push back.
Yeah, I would say I would add the qualifier that they enacted salvation for God's people and not like they weren't acting on the behalf of, not the secular.
I agree with that, but I think Daniel, even though in some ways he enacted salvation, I think that what he did was good for the broader community. It was more of I think it was his general grace. But I'm glad you pushed back on it. So, Garden of Eden. Adam is told to tend the garden. And I would say that clearly means what it says, tend the garden. But as more and more humans get together, you have civilizations and structures form, and I would argue that tending the garden in a truly biblical sense means tending the physical garden, but it also means tending the social garden, which is thinking about how we govern our families, how we govern our churches, how we govern our community, and what that means. I think that the Bible gives us clear ideas on attitudes that should or should not be adopted towards government. My favorite on this list, and I'll just point it out for you later, is the Hezekiah. Oops, I have to go that way. Oh, that's not going to work. The avoid apathy one. Does anyone know this story from Hezekiah at all? Without context? So Hezekiah is told by God, the Assyrians or the Babylonians are going to come and they're going to take everything from you. But they're not going to do it in this generation. They're going to do it in your kids' generation. And Hezekiah's response is, that's their problem. That's not Hezekiah. Whew! All right, I had the word Hezekiah there, but it should say, I think it's 2 Kings. 2 Kings, thank you. Woo! I'm making up new chapters. But I think that the Bible says a lot about what our attitudes can be as we see society moving in certain directions. And the other one I really like is Moses, who when God says, hey, these people are done, it's time to wipe them out, doesn't give in to that sense of inevitability, but pleads with God, trusting that God is good. And so I would point that out. Okay, how should Christians interact with American politics? Dennis put this up last week, but I want to go through the three options very briefly. And these are three kind of versions of what it means to engage politically. The first one is the Benedict option, and the idea there is that Christians should do kind of the monastic thing. They should pull back from society. The only thing they should fight for in society is freedom of religion, because that's what we need, and other than that, we can form our own communities, and it's not just that. He's not saying pull back from politics. He's saying rebuild Christian community. And so I think he has a sense in which we've been co-opted by the culture, and unless we rebuild Christian community, if we just go into politics, we're going to lose our identity completely. So that's Richard Dreher. Eric Metaxas, you might know, he wrote a book on Martin Luther. And so he writes this book called The Letter to the American Church. I included the quote from Martin Luther, He wrote a book on Bonhoeffer. And I included the quote from Bonhoeffer because in this book, Letter to the American Church, Metaxas makes the argument that we are at a Bonhoeffer point where we really do have to start speaking truth. Now, his primary piece is that we are needed in the political and cultural spheres, and the way that we engage those is by speaking truth into lies. When we have lies from our culture or from politics, we speak truth back into those, which is very different than the Boniface option. The story of Boniface is fun. Go ahead, read it. The Wikipedia article is pretty good. Saint Boniface went to Germany as a missionary, 1300s, I believe, and there was a large oak tree in the middle of the square called Thor's Oak, Jagdsaal, for those of you who like the Marvel comics. This guy who's there to go witness to the pagan Germans decides, well, they've got this tree they worship in the middle of the town, I'm going to cut it down. So he says, if Thor is real, he'll strike me with lightning and I'll die. And for 3 hours, he sat there and felled at this tree with his axe before he knocked it over. Tree falls over, man doesn't die. Town says, well, guess Thor's not real. Who do you serve? Right? So it very much an Elijah approach. Now, I want to be very clear on this one. You have to very carefully define what idols you're going after, because the idols you go after can be idols yourself. But there are 3 different versions of what it means. So I want to give you a chance in your groups to discuss briefly those 3 options. Want to share briefly on one of these? Yes, Paul.
This didn't come up in our discussion, but my opinion, the church has to rebuild true Christian community. It doesn't have to be isolated. It shouldn't be isolated.
Okay.
But we do need to be together, faithful to God, like He's called us. And some of us are called to do number 2 and number 3. We're probably all called to do it at some scale in our own spheres.
So you went with Rick's answer and said yes.
Well,
too much of a spectrum to say yes on this one.
Jeff, I was looking for Christ connections in each of these three options. Where do I see the life and the person and the teachings of Jesus in each of these three options? I think what Peter pointed out was that the Metaxas' speaking truth into lies seemed like a pretty significant what would Jesus do kind of a thing, but that was just kind of the attitude for the brief amount of time we had. I was like, how does Jesus show up in all of these? Yeah, or rather, how do these show up in Jesus' life, mystery?
And I think also the most important thing is that people hear the truth. I think that we can't, I think part of the thing that's always in the back of my mind when we're talking about how should the church be engaging in politics is the idea of how I can't expect a non-believer to act non-sinfully. That's an unrealistic expectation for me to expect a non-believer to turn away from sin by themselves. The Bible says that's not going to happen. But the most important thing is that they learn the truth of the gospel. And so I think that that's the big thing, and what that looks like is speaking the capital T truth into all areas of life and letting that be what pervades our thing. And I think that can be what will lead to change bigger than other things. So.
I think that's a good point. And I would say that for these 3 points, I think Josh and Peter, your question gets to the root of it, which is part of this is how do we collectively care for the garden and do things in society that help people who are not part of the family of Christ. But the other piece is how do we speak into the culture in such a way that we draw people into the family of Christ? And I think I would argue, I think that all 3 of these authors have a piece of that in mind, whether or not they hit there. I'm not going to land on one of these, but I would like to just point out that regardless of whether you land on one of these, all 3 of them say the current status quo is not an option, that there is something we should be doing that's different. And so I would just leave us with that. I'm going to put one last book on the board, which is this fabulous book by Wayne Grudem. He loves long books. This one is fascinating if you're not aware of it. So he writes Politics According to the Bible. And I'll just open it up. He's got a chapter here talking about the environment. He's got a chapter here talking about national defense. What should Christians do about Islamic jihad? He's got a section here where he even gets into what about guest worker programs, right? And he tries to say, very carefully, how should Christians think about these topics? And so he warns us to avoid 5 things. And I think today we did a great job avoiding all of those. We don't want to compel religion. We don't want to exclude religion. We don't want to think government is all bad. We should only do evangelism, not politics, or we should only do politics and not evangelism. And so he ends with this particular line, which I thought was an interesting line, which is broad enoughly written that we have to figure out what it means, which means I don't have an answer for you. But I do want to say thank you for the discussion, and
Jeff,
we're all set.
do you agree with a lot of what he says in this book?
I've seen a lot of good stuff in his
Okay.
here.
So you're recommending
Well, I am saying that Wayne Grudem is a very thoughtful person
Yeah.
who tries to write very even-handedly. He wrote a systematic theology book that was just really, really solid.
Okay.
And so
Does he take stands, or does he just?
I think he tries to in some ways. I think he's trying to provoke discussion at some level. Anyway.
Thanks, Ava.
Abe.